think Christmas time is a time of stories, and stories are always good for all of us, regardless of how old we are as children. That was odd, thought Sarah to herself as she heard the knock at her door. Who would be knocking at the beginning of the second hour? Most of the people in the village knew that in her old age, she wouldn't be up and about so early in the day. I wonder who this can be rapping at the door, she murmured. She struggled a bit, opening the heavy door, which her nephew had promised to fix for her, but hadn't gotten around to repairing. It was these old hinges. They no longer held the weight of the door, and it stuck in two places as she attempted to open it. Immediately, she spied a gentle-looking young man standing on the step at the door. Although she had never laid eyes on him before, she knew exactly what he wanted. It wasn't every day that someone with writing implements, ink and papyrus visited her. Yes, there had been occasions in the past when people had asked her to share her remembrances. Sarah was a young girl when her father had died, and she'd moved into the house to care for Mary. Mary was old then, and Sarah's task was to keep the place tidy, prepare the meals, and look after her. When Mary died, Sarah was given the house. It was a simple home, but for Sarah it was filled with many joyful memories, and it made her happy just to be there. Of course, everyone in town knew that this house was the place where one of Jesus' disciples had grown up. The story was that after Jesus' death, his disciple had taken Mary to live with him and look after her as his own mother. She also looked after the beloved as her son. But the beloved disciple had died about the same time as Sarah's father, and it made sense that she move in to care for Mary. Strange, thought Sarah, but she never knew the real name of the man whose home had become hers. Everyone simply referred to him as the beloved, and she had too. Sarah could tell that the man at the door would ask her to share stories that Mary had confided in her. But before the fellow could utter a word, Sarah invited him in, asked him to sit on a mat against the wall, and began talking. "I can see why you've come," she said. "You want to hear stories about the Messiah. You want to hear stories that Mary told about her son Jesus. Where would you like me to begin?" The man replied, "Did she ever talk to you about the birth of her son?" Sarah was startled. No one had ever before asked her this question. Generally, when people had come around asking questions, they began by asking Sarah what Mary had told her about the day Jesus died on the cross. They would also ask about the day of the discovery of the empty tomb. Most were curious about what had happened on the first day of the week when Mary Magdalene had gone to the tomb and found the stone rolled away. She immediately came and told Peter and the beloved what had occurred. Sarah knew the story well because the townspeople had heard it from the lips of the beloved disciple himself and retold the story quite often. When the beloved and Peter heard what Mary said, they raced to the tomb. Sarah had trouble imagining the beloved racing anywhere. Her only remembrances of him was that of an old man hobbled by age and slow to move. She tried to picture in her mind how the beloved might have appeared as a young man and how he outraced Peter to the tomb. Peter was the first to go into the tomb and see the burial cloths. The beloved followed Peter into the tomb, saw the cloths, and immediately knew that Jesus had been raised from the dead. Sarah had always wondered how the burial cloths lying in the tomb could have been a sign to the beloved that Jesus was risen. But no one seemed to know the answer to that question. All she knew is that the bandages were a sign of the resurrection of the Son of Mary. "Excuse me, sir," Sarah said, "but before we begin, would you be so kind as to tell me about yourself?" He replied, "I am a follower of the Christ, the Son of the living God. For much of my life I helped other people get well from sickness and disease. All the while, I was living a joyless life. You see, my wife had died and I missed her terribly. Little by little, I forgot about myself and focused all my attention on others. Then one day, a friend invited me to come with him and learn about Jesus. It changed my life. It gave me a reason to live, not just for others, but also for myself." When he finished, Sarah offered him a cup of cool water. He thanked her and took out his writing implements. "Please," he said, "is there anything which you can tell me about the birth of Jesus?" "I must tell you," she said, "it has been a long time since anyone has come asking questions, and you are the first one who has wanted to know something about his birth. You see," said the man, "I've been commissioned to write an account of the events surrounding the life of Jesus. So it would be helpful for me to know something of his birth. What can you tell me?" Sarah began to tell him what Mary had shared with her. She spoke of the census and the trip to Bethlehem. She talked of the birth in the cave, which was used as a stable for animals, and how Jesus had been laid in a manger. Then she said, "But you know, there was one thing which Mary talked about again and again. It was the night of the birth, and the shepherds appeared with a fantastic story. They informed Mary that angels had surrounded them and told them that the Messiah was born in the city in which King David had also been born, Bethlehem." The man asked, "Did the shepherds say how they would be able to find the child in such a large city?" "Now that you mention it," Mary said, "they did." Mary said that she pondered this in her heart for many years. The shepherds told her that there was a sign which would reveal the Messiah to them. He would be wrapped in bands of cloth, and that he would be lying in a manger. Mary had come to believe that those cloths were a sign of God's anointed one. "Do you think that could be so?" she asked. "Could the strips of cloth be a sign of the Messiah's appearing?" The man laid down his stylus and rubbed his eyes. He massaged his writing hand and reflected upon the question. "God gives us many signs," he said. "Jesus, I am finding, was a man of signs. It doesn't surprise me that the shepherds were given a sign by God in order to find him. Strips of cloth could very well reveal the Messiah." The hours passed by quickly, and the man had written quite a bit. Sarah told him what she remembered and how Mary explained in great detail the appearance of the angel Gabriel and her visit to her kinswoman Elizabeth. It was about the 6th hour when the questions stopped. The man thanked Sarah, excused himself, and left, but not before taking out 2 coins and giving them to her for her living. He made his goodbye in a customary way among believers. "May the peace of Christ be with you," he said. She replied, "And also with you." Sarah turned to her daily chores. There would be bread to bake and clothing to clean, but first she would have to go to the well to draw water. As she left the house, she couldn't stop thinking of her encounter with the man. Could bands wrapped around the Christ child have been a sign of the Messiah? When the man had come into the house, Sarah was certain that he would ask about the resurrection, but he was much more intent upon the birth. It was curious to Sarah, however, that her immediate thoughts focused on the race to the tomb and the cloths from the burial shroud lying there. Cloths wrapped around the child signified birth. Cloths found in the tomb signified to the beloved Jesus' resurrection. Sarah took the pitcher and started toward the well. The man's visit had sparked her inquisitive nature. God had always spoken to God's people through signs. There was the sign of the pillar of fire at night and the cloud by day, which led the children of Israel on their Exodus journey. There were the signs which Jesus himself performed. He had changed water to wine. He had made a blind man see. Could bands of cloth be a sacrament, a sign of the Messiah's presence? If so, what might the cloths represent? Sarah racked her brain. There was something else about cloths. What was it? What else had she remembered Mary telling her about Jesus? Where else had she heard about cloths? The more she tried to remember, the less it would come to her. She decided to let it go. It would come later. And she walked down the alleyway and past the homes of her neighbors. Most of them were followers of Jesus, and therefore had taken names of the disciples. As a matter of fact, some of the people had moved there because it was the village of the beloved, and the mother of Jesus had lived there. The faithful had raised their children in the belief that Jesus was the Messiah. There was the house of James, and next to it, It was the home of Philip. Across the way there was the house of Andrew, and toward the center of the village, well, there were the homes of John and Lazarus. Ah, Lazarus. That sparked a thought. It was Lazarus who had been the dear friend of Jesus. Jesus had gone to visit his sisters, Martha and Mary, upon learning of his death. Everyone in the town knew the story of how Jesus had wept at the death of his friend. Jesus had asked to be taken to the tomb, and after praying to God, he called Lazarus from the grave. The dead man came out, and Jesus ordered him unbound from his burial cloths. That was it. When Jesus called Lazarus back to life, the burial cloths were removed from his body. Sarah drew the water, filled her pitcher, and headed back toward her home. The first sign of the Messiah, which God gave, was at the birth. It was the sign of life. And this shall be a sign for you. You shall find a babe wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger. The cloth bands were a sign of birth, of life. The second sign of the Messiah was a sign of new life. The new life was signified by the cloths removed from Lazarus as he exited the tomb. Unbind him and let him go. Lazarus would certainly die again. He hadn't been resurrected, but he had been given new life. And finally, there was the sign of the cloths found lying in the tomb. These signified resurrection. And the cloth that covered his face was not with the other cloths, but rolled up in a place by itself. 3 cloths, each signifying the presence of the Messiah. One representing birth, another representing new life, and the other representing resurrection. Sarah was struck by yet another sign of the Messiah's presence. Each time the cloths were mentioned in the stories told to her, someone was also present with them. A woman seemed to be at the scene as a seal upon the sign. At the birth of Jesus, it was Mary, the mother of God. At the tomb of Lazarus, it was Mary, the sister of the man brought back to life. On the day of the resurrection, it had been Mary of Magdala. Sarah considered how much like a revelation of God all this was now appearing. There were the signs of cloth revealing the Messiah's life-giving presence. Each sign was sealed by the presence of a Mary. Mary, mother of Jesus, Mary, sister of Lazarus, and Mary Magdalene. Birth, new life, resurrection. These things were the story of God's anointed one. Sarah was struck by the simplicity of the signs. They weren't great signs and wonders in the heavens. They were simple, the everyday stuff of life, strips of cloth. They were cloths like she herself had woven and used at times too numerous to recount. Cloth so commonplace and so plain had become a life-giving sacrament of God. Sarah reached the house. She always enjoyed returning home, even after a short time away. It was warm with wonderful memories of her years with Mary. Sarah remembered coming to live with her and how Mary had relied upon her. Mary needed her, but she needed Mary as well. Mary was the mother that Sarah never had. Her mother had died while giving birth to her, and her father had died while she was still a young girl. Living with Mary was like being reborn. She'd been given a new chance at living. The home was filled with memories of her own birth through living with Mary. She reflected on the man who had just visited her. He was a man of gentleness and kindness who had given her 2 coins. What had he shared about himself? He had spent most of his life caring for the sick and healing them while his own life had become barren and empty. He had been brought to Christ and his life had been transformed. He'd been brought back from the dead. She wondered if he secretly understood what it must have been like for Lazarus when he was called from the tomb. Her thoughts turned to Mary and the beloved. Jesus had given them to each other as he died on the cross. They too must have died with him, their hearts broken in sorrow. Yet through their love and compassion for one another, they had been resurrected from the dead. Birth, new life, and resurrection, thought Sarah. These are the signs which reveal the life-giving presence of the Messiah. Birth, new life, resurrection. These are the signs of God's life-giving presence, which had been woven into the fabric of her life through the coming of the Messiah. The shepherds told Mary what the angels had said. "This shall be a sign for you. You shall find a babe wrapped in bands of cloth and lying in a manger." Mary had kept all these things, pondering them in her heart. Sarah, too, would remember the signs of Christ's life-giving presence in her life and ponder them in her heart.